You really think she understands a single word? The sentence drifted across the candlelit dining room in flawless Russian, quiet enough to sound private, yet loud enough for the men around the table to laugh beneath their breath. The laughter blended with the soft notes of a jazz trio, the delicate clink of crystal glasses, and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 30 floors below. But somehow those few words cut through everything else. Naomi Brooks didn't look up. She simply adjusted the silverware beside the billionaire's plate with steady hands and the calm precision of someone who had learned long ago that dignity often begins with silence. Around her, the restaurant glowed with warm amber light reflected across polished marble floors and towering windows that framed the glittering skyline. This wasn't just another luxury restaurant. It was the kind of place where billion-dollar partnerships were born over aged bourbon, imported caviar, and conversations spoken in lowered voices. Every guest wore confidence like another expensive accessory. Every smile carried a hidden agenda. At the center of the private dining room sat Ethan Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Ventures, one of America's fastest-growing investment firms. At 39, Ethan had built a reputation that extended far beyond Wall Street. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Magazine covers praised his vision, while former employees whispered about his impossible standards. He believed intelligence should always dominate the room, and tonight he intended to prove exactly that to a delegation of international investors visiting from Eastern Europe. Russian had become his favorite instrument for creating an invisible wall around conversations. He enjoyed the certainty that few people nearby could understand what was really being said. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling mineral water before speaking another sentence in Russian, his expression barely changing. The men beside him smiled wider this time. One of them glanced toward Naomi before quietly shaking his head in amusement. None of them noticed that her breathing never changed. None of them noticed the almost invisible pause as she reached for a fresh linen napkin. To them, she was simply another waitress moving through the background of an expensive evening, another face destined to disappear once dessert had been served. That assumption had followed Naomi through nearly every shift she had ever worked. Guests remembered the wine she recommended, but forgot her name. They complimented the restaurant while overlooking the people who made every evening possible. She had grown accustomed to being underestimated, not because it felt fair, but because experience had taught her that people often revealed their true character when they believed no one important was listening. Across the room, another server caught Naomi's eye for only a second, silently asking if everything was all right. Naomi answered with the smallest reassuring smile before continuing toward the next table, her posture straight, her pace unhurried, her expression unreadable. If anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed that she never once appeared confused by the Russian conversation unfolding only a few feet away. Instead, there was something almost reflective in her eyes, as though every word being spoken had settled somewhere deeper than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. The evening was only beginning, and without realizing it, the most powerful man in the restaurant had already handed the quietest woman in the room the moment that would change everything. Naomi Brooks had never believed that respect arrived with a name tag or a paycheck. It revealed itself in quieter moments, in the way someone acknowledged another human being when there was nothing to gain from doing so. Every evening before the dinner rush began, she paused for exactly 30 seconds beside the service station, straightened her black apron, smoothed the loose strand of hair behind her ear, and reminded herself that every guest deserved professionalism whether they offered kindness in return or not. It was a promise she had made years earlier, long before she ever stepped inside one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. As she moved gracefully between polished tables carrying handcrafted appetizers and sparkling mineral water, she noticed details most people ignored. A nervous investor tapping 2 fingers against his crystal glass. A young couple celebrating an anniversary while pretending not to worry about the price of the menu. An elderly woman smiling every time the pianist shifted from jazz to classical standards. Naomi collected moments instead of assumptions, believing they revealed more about people than the conversations they intended others to hear. That quiet habit had become her greatest strength. She listened without staring. She observed without judging. She remembered without interrupting. The restaurant manager often joked that Naomi could predict what guests needed before they realized it themselves. Few understood that her attention came from genuine curiosity rather than talent alone. Tonight, however, one table seemed determined to test every ounce of that patience. Ethan Caldwell continued entertaining his guests with polished confidence, effortlessly shifting between English and Russian as if changing languages were simply another display of influence. His visitors appeared impressed, nodding politely whenever he translated selected portions of their discussion while carefully leaving other remarks untouched. Every so often another laugh circled the table, followed by another quick glance toward Naomi before the conversation resumed. She never acknowledged it. Instead, she refilled glasses with the same measured movements, thanked each guest with the same calm voice, and stepped away before anyone could mistake professionalism for submission. One member of the visiting delegation quietly studied her as she passed. Viktor Sokolov had spent decades negotiating international contracts, and experience had taught him that the smartest person in the room was rarely the loudest. Something about Naomi's expression unsettled his assumptions. She did not look confused. She did not appear uncomfortable. Instead, she carried the composed confidence of someone waiting rather than enduring. He filed the observation away without mentioning it. Nearby, another server whispered that table 12 seemed unusually demanding tonight. Naomi simply smiled and answered that every table deserved the same care. She meant it. Bitterness had never improved anyone's evening. Yet beneath her calm exterior rested memories no guest could see. Shelves lined with Russian literature borrowed from a neighborhood library. Long winters spent practicing pronunciation until every consonant sounded natural. Professors who insisted that language was more than vocabulary because every sentence carried history, culture, and respect. Those years had shaped her far more deeply than any expensive dining room ever could. Looking across the polished floor toward Ethan's table, Naomi recognized something else entirely. His Russian was fluent enough to impress listeners unfamiliar with the language, but hidden beneath his confidence were subtle shortcuts, casual expressions placed where formal ones belonged, and cultural nuances quietly overlooked. None of it mattered until he decided to use those words as a shield against someone he believed could never understand them. The evening continued beneath golden lights and gentle piano melodies, yet an invisible current had begun flowing beneath every conversation, drawing everyone a little closer to a moment none of them expected to witness. Ethan Caldwell had spent most of his adult life believing that every room eventually belonged to the person with the greatest leverage. Money opened doors. Reputation kept them open. Confidence made people stop asking questions. By the age of 39, he had transformed Caldwell Ventures from a modest investment firm into a financial powerhouse, with offices stretching from New York to London and strategic partnerships reaching deep into Europe. Business magazines praised his discipline. Television hosts admired his relentless focus. Young entrepreneurs quoted his interviews as if they were modern business scripture. Success had rewarded nearly every instinct he trusted, and over time that success quietly convinced him that he was rarely the one who needed to change. Tonight's dinner represented another milestone in that remarkable career. The visiting investors controlled access to expanding markets across Eastern Europe and securing their partnership could reshape the next decade of his company. Every detail of the evening had been planned with precision, from the seating arrangement to the imported wines chosen to reflect each guest's preferences. Ethan enjoyed preparation because preparation usually guaranteed control. Speaking Russian had become another extension of that philosophy. Years earlier, he had hired private tutors, traveled through Moscow and St. Petersburg for negotiations, and practiced tirelessly until he could comfortably conduct meetings without an interpreter. His fluency impressed clients, separated him from competitors, and often allowed him to steer conversations before others realized what was happening. Over time, however, language slowly transformed from a bridge into a badge of superiority. He no longer used it only to communicate. He used it to establish status. Across the table, his longtime executive vice president, Daniel Mercer, recognized the familiar pattern unfolding once again. Daniel had worked beside Ethan for nearly 12 years and understood both his brilliance and his blind spots. Whenever Ethan felt completely confident, his sharp wit often drifted toward quiet arrogance. Daniel noticed the quick remarks delivered in Russian, the restrained laughter from the guests, and the almost invisible glances directed toward Naomi as she continued serving each course with unwavering professionalism. A small voice in the back of Daniel's mind suggested that the jokes had gone too far, but years inside executive boardrooms had taught him that challenging powerful personalities during important negotiations rarely ended well. He remained silent, convincing himself that the evening would soon move on. Meanwhile, Ethan interpreted Naomi's composure as proof that his assumptions were correct. If she had understood even a fraction of the conversation, surely she would have reacted somehow. Instead, she continued replacing dinner plates, recommending wine pairings with quiet confidence, and thanking every guest with exactly the same respectful tone. Her calmness reinforced his certainty, never crossing his mind that genuine confidence often looks remarkably similar to quiet patience. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights reflecting across the Hudson River, while inside the private dining room every polished surface mirrored an atmosphere of effortless elegance. Yet beneath the soft music and refined conversation, two entirely different stories were moving toward the same destination. One was built on the confidence that wealth could define every interaction. The other rested upon the quiet strength of knowledge waiting for the exact right moment to reveal itself, proving once again that the greatest surprises rarely announce their arrival before they change the entire room. The first course had barely been cleared when the atmosphere around Ethan Caldwell's table shifted almost imperceptibly. The laughter became a little louder, the Russian phrases a little longer, the confidence a little sharper. Success has a quiet habit of convincing people that every thought deserves an audience, and tonight Ethan spoke with the relaxed certainty of a man who believed the room naturally revolved around him. He complimented one investor in Russian, joked with another, then allowed his voice to drift just enough for everyone at the table to hear another remark about the waitress who continued moving gracefully between crystal glasses and polished silver. Several guests smiled politely, though not all of them seemed entirely comfortable anymore. Viktor Sokolov lowered his eyes toward his plate for a brief moment before exchanging a thoughtful glance with another member of the delegation. Years of international business had taught him that true sophistication was measured less by vocabulary than by the respect shown to people with no influence over a negotiation. Across the room, Naomi remained focused on her work. She delivered fresh bread to a nearby couple celebrating their anniversary, answered a question about the chef's seasonal menu, and quietly thanked a family preparing to leave after dessert. Her attention never appeared divided, yet every Russian sentence from Ethan's table reached her ears with complete clarity. She understood every joke, every assumption, every confident remark hidden behind the comfort of a language the speaker believed no one else could follow. Even so, her expression never changed. There was no anger crossing her face, no wounded pride, no attempt to defend herself. She simply continued doing exactly what she had come to do, allowing patience to speak where emotion easily could have interrupted. Daniel Mercer noticed the contrast becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan seemed increasingly energized by the reaction of his guests, while Naomi somehow appeared even calmer than before. Daniel had witnessed enough difficult negotiations to recognize that silence often carried more weight than arguments. Something about the waitress's composure unsettled him, though he could not explain why. It was not the silence of someone intimidated. It was the silence of someone choosing the right moment. Near the service station, the restaurant manager quietly complimented Naomi for keeping the evening running smoothly despite the demanding private event. She answered with a warm smile and a simple thank you before lifting another tray. No complaint escaped her lips. No frustration appeared in her voice. She treated the compliment exactly as she treated every guest, with steady humility that required no audience. Meanwhile, Ethan reached for his menu again while continuing the discussion in Russian. As he casually referenced one of the specialty dishes, he confidently translated a description for his guests, overlooking a subtle cultural meaning that slightly altered the chef's intention. None of the executives around him noticed the difference. They accepted his explanation without question. Only Victor's eyebrows lifted almost invisibly before his attention drifted toward Naomi, who happened to be standing only a few feet away, arranging fresh glasses for the next course. For the first time that evening, Victor wondered whether the quiet woman serving dinner had understood something no one else had even realized had been said incorrectly. The soft piano continued filling the restaurant with elegant melodies, but beneath its gentle rhythm another melody had begun to form, one composed of patience, misplaced confidence, and a truth waiting for exactly the right sentence to bring an entire room to complete silence. By the time the main course arrived, the dinner had settled into the comfortable rhythm that usually accompanies people convinced they are winning. Freshly prepared steaks, seafood, and seasonal vegetables were placed before the guests with flawless timing, while the city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like scattered stars. Every conversation blended into the elegant soundtrack of polished silver, quiet laughter, and soft piano melodies. Ethan Caldwell welcomed the atmosphere. To him, evenings like this were carefully choreographed performances, and he believed he remained firmly in control of every scene. As Naomi approached with another tray, Ethan glanced toward her only briefly before continuing his discussion in Russian. This time his comments carried a sharper edge. He casually suggested that luxury restaurants train their staff to smile without understanding the conversations happening around them. One investor offered an uneasy chuckle. Another looked down into his glass instead of joining the joke. Daniel Mercer shifted slightly in his chair, sensing that the room had begun to drift away from simple humor towards something less comfortable. Naomi gently placed each plate in front of the guests with the same composed professionalism she had shown since the evening began. She thanked each person individually, answered a question about the chef's preparation with quiet confidence, and stepped back without acknowledging a single Russian sentence that had just passed over her head. Her silence seemed almost effortless, yet inside her mind every word remained perfectly clear. She recognized the grammar, the tone, and even the regional expressions Ethan borrowed to impress his guests. More importantly, she recognized the difference between speaking a language and understanding the people who spoke it. As she returned toward the service station, her eyes briefly rested on a leather portfolio lying open beside Viktor Sokolov. A printed proposal contained both English and Russian summaries prepared for the night's negotiations. Without slowing her pace, Naomi noticed a subtle translation inconsistency in one of the Russian headings. It was not a dramatic mistake. It was the kind of detail only someone deeply familiar with both languages and cultures would immediately recognize. She quietly looked away and continued walking, saying nothing. A few moments later, the executive assistant assigned to the international delegation approached Ethan with a polite question about one of the translated documents. Ethan answered confidently in Russian, offering an explanation that sounded polished enough to satisfy most listeners. Victor listened without interrupting, but his thoughtful expression remained unchanged. He had begun connecting small observations throughout the evening. The waitress who never appeared confused. The tiny hesitation when Ethan translated certain phrases. The calm confidence that seemed completely untouched by the jokes spoken only a few feet away. None of those details proved anything by themselves. Yet together they created a quiet sense that something important had not yet been revealed. Naomi collected another empty tray and paused only long enough to straighten a folded menu resting near the entrance to the private dining room. Printed beneath the English description was a short Russian welcome message prepared especially for the visiting delegation. Her eyes lingered on one misplaced accent mark before she gently adjusted the menu back into perfect alignment. No one noticed the tiny gesture except Victor, whose curiosity deepened with every passing minute. The evening still appeared flawless to most of the guests, but beneath the polished elegance an invisible thread had tightened. Confidence had continued speaking. Patience had continued listening. And somewhere between those two, the moment that would redefine the entire dinner had quietly drawn within reach. The dessert menus had just been placed on the table when the evening finally encountered something Ethan Caldwell had not anticipated. Viktor Sokolov closed the leather portfolio in front of him, looked toward Ethan with a courteous smile, and spoke in measured Russian. His question sounded simple enough, asking for clarification about a phrase in the partnership proposal that described the long-term management structure after the investment closed. Ethan answered immediately, his confidence never wavering. He translated the sentence into English for the rest of the table, then returned to Russian, explaining a subtle expression that, according to him, reflected trust and shared leadership. Several executives nodded, satisfied by the explanation. But Victor did not. Instead, he remained silent for a moment, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document. Then he quietly replied in Russian, asking why Ethan had chosen a phrase that actually suggested supervision rather than partnership. The distinction seemed small, almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the language. Yet in international business, such nuances could reshape the entire meaning of an agreement. Ethan hesitated. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, but in negotiations, 2 seconds can feel like an hour. Daniel Mercer noticed the pause immediately. Around the table, conversations faded. Even the pianist in the main dining room seemed impossibly distant beneath the growing silence. Ethan cleared his throat and attempted another explanation, speaking confidently even as uncertainty began slipping into his carefully polished delivery. Victor listened politely without interrupting, although his thoughtful expression suggested he remained unconvinced. At that exact moment, Naomi approached carrying freshly brewed coffee and tea. She placed each cup before the guests with the same calm precision she had shown all evening. As she reached Victor's place setting, the older investor looked up at her with quiet curiosity before returning his attention to the proposal. Ethan continued speaking in Russian, trying to recover the conversation, but another small translation drifted away from its intended meaning. Naomi stopped only because Victor gently addressed her in Russian. His voice carried neither surprise nor expectation. It was simply a respectful question. "Excuse me, would you please tell me how you would understand this sentence?" Time seemed to pause. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. Ethan turned toward Naomi with an expression that mixed disbelief and quiet irritation. A nearby server froze beside the service station. Naomi looked first at Victor, then at Ethan, maintaining the same composed professionalism she had carried throughout the evening. After a brief, respectful pause, she answered in clear, natural Russian. Her pronunciation was effortless, her cadence warm, and her choice of words reflected the cultural nuance that had been missing from the earlier explanation. She did not challenge Ethan. She did not embarrass him. She simply translated the sentence exactly as it had been written before calmly explaining why one particular expression suggested collaboration while another implied control. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. Victor's face brightened with genuine appreciation. Another member of the delegation smiled in immediate agreement. Daniel blinked twice, almost forgetting the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Ethan remained completely still. For the first time that evening, no one at the table was looking at the billionaire. Every eye rested on the quiet waitress who had spoken only when invited, revealing not only flawless Russian, but something far more valuable, the confidence that comes from knowledge carried with humility rather than displayed for applause. No one spoke. The silence settled over the private dining room so completely that even the soft piano drifting in from the main restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Ethan Caldwell remained motionless, his hand still resting beside his untouched coffee cup. Moments earlier, he had commanded every conversation at the table. Now the conversation belonged to someone who had never once tried to take it. Viktor Sokolov looked at Naomi with genuine admiration, not because she had spoken flawless Russian, but because she had answered with remarkable precision while showing complete respect to everyone involved. There had been no trace of arrogance in her explanation, no attempt to expose anyone's mistake for personal satisfaction. She had simply protected the meaning of the words. Victor smiled warmly before continuing the discussion in Russian, this time directing every question toward Naomi. She answered naturally, occasionally pausing to explain why certain expressions carried emotional meanings that literal translations often missed. She spoke about how language reflected trust, history, and cultural expectations rather than merely vocabulary. Each explanation was thoughtful, concise, and remarkably practical. The visiting executives exchanged approving glances. One of them quietly admitted that her interpretation sounded exactly like the language used during negotiations in Moscow. Another nodded in agreement, adding that the smallest differences in wording often determined whether business relationships lasted for years or ended before they truly began. Daniel Mercer watched the exchange unfold with growing disbelief. During 12 years beside Ethan, he had attended hundreds of executive dinners, but he had never witnessed a room change direction so completely without anyone raising a voice. He finally understood what had unsettled him throughout the evening. Naomi had never been waiting for revenge. She had simply been waiting for truth to become necessary. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes toward the proposal lying open before him. For the first time that night, he reread the translated paragraphs with fresh attention, noticing subtle distinctions he had overlooked while relying on confidence instead of precision. The realization settled quietly across his expression. Knowledge and certainty were not always the same thing. Across the dining room, other guests had begun noticing that something unusual was happening inside the private event. Servers exchanged curious looks while continuing their work with professional discretion. The restaurant manager observed from a respectful distance, sensing only that the atmosphere had shifted in a way impossible to explain from appearances alone. Naomi, meanwhile, gently stepped back after answering Victor's final question. She thanked him politely, wished everyone an enjoyable evening, and prepared to continue serving another table as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Victor stopped her with one final question, asking where she had learned Russian so fluently. Naomi smiled with quiet humility before, explaining that she had studied Slavic languages in college, completed an academic exchange program in Moscow, and had always believed that understanding another language meant understanding another way of respecting people. She never mentioned awards, grades, or achievements. She offered only the simple truth. Victor slowly closed the proposal and looked directly at Ethan. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. He said that successful partnerships required more than financial strength. They required listening carefully to people who often went unnoticed. Around the table, every executive silently agreed. The most influential lesson of the evening had not come from the billionaire who arrived expecting to impress everyone. It had come from the quiet waitress who never once demanded to be seen, yet had become impossible for anyone in the room to overlook. The evening did not end with applause. It ended with something far more powerful. Perspective. Viktor Sokolov carefully folded the proposal, rested both hands on the table, and looked around the room before speaking in calm English so everyone could understand. He explained that successful international partnerships were built on precision, trust, and mutual respect. Financial strength could open negotiations, but character determined whether those negotiations survived. Every executive around the table listened without interruption. Ethan Caldwell remained unusually quiet. For perhaps the first time in years, he realized that the most valuable contribution during the meeting had not come from the person with the largest company or the most impressive resume. It had come from the person everyone had almost overlooked. Daniel Mercer slowly closed his notebook, recognizing that the atmosphere had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, every conversation had revolved around Ethan's accomplishments. Now the discussion centered on cultural understanding, humility, and the importance of listening before assuming. Victor turned toward Naomi once again and thanked her sincerely for preserving the intended meaning of the proposal. He explained that a single mistranslated expression might not seem important to outsiders, yet in cross-cultural business relationships, it could create misunderstandings that lasted for years. Naomi responded with her usual warmth, saying that every language carried values that deserved careful handling. She added that translation was never only about replacing words. It was about protecting the intentions behind them. Her answer earned quiet nods from every member of the visiting delegation. Ethan finally lifted his eyes and spoke for the first time since the conversation had shifted. His voice remained composed, although noticeably softer than before. He admitted that he had become overly confident and had relied too heavily on assumptions instead of careful listening. It was not a dramatic speech, nor an attempt to erase what had already happened. It was simply an honest acknowledgement that expertise required continuous learning, regardless of success or status. Naomi accepted his words with the same professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. She neither celebrated nor criticized the moment. Instead, she wished everyone an enjoyable dessert service and prepared to continue her responsibilities. Before she could step away, Victor made one final request. He asked whether she would be willing to review several cultural translations for future meetings as an independent language consultant. The invitation surprised everyone at the table. Daniel smiled quietly, recognizing the opportunity immediately. Ethan looked toward Naomi with genuine respect rather than surprise. The proposal was not charity. It was recognition earned entirely through ability. Naomi thanked Victor for the confidence he had shown in her work and replied that she would gladly consider the opportunity after completing her shift because every guest in the restaurant still deserved the same attention. Her answer left an even stronger impression than her flawless Russian. She had been offered a remarkable professional opportunity, yet she refused to abandon the responsibilities already entrusted to her. As she walked toward another table carrying fresh coffee, several guests who had quietly witnessed portions of the evening greeted her. With warm smiles that had not been there before. Nothing about her posture changed. Nothing about her pace became hurried or proud. She remained exactly who she had been when the night began. The difference was that everyone else had finally changed the way they saw her. Wealth had entered the restaurant expecting admiration. Humility quietly earned something far more lasting. It earned respect. The last guest slowly rose from the table as Manhattan shimmered beneath the midnight skyline, its lights reflecting across the glass like thousands of quiet reminders that every city carried stories no headline would ever capture. The investors thanked the restaurant staff one by one before making their way toward the elevators, but nearly every farewell paused for just a moment longer when they reached Naomi Brooks. Their words were simple, their handshakes sincere, and their expressions carried something far more valuable than admiration. They carried respect. Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside the window after everyone else had begun leaving the private dining room. For several long moments, he watched the city without speaking, replaying the evening through a perspective he had not expected to discover. He had entered believing knowledge was another way to demonstrate status. He was leaving with the uncomfortable but necessary realization that true knowledge required humility first. When Naomi returned to collect the final coffee cup, Ethan stepped forward before she could continue her work. His voice no longer carried the polished certainty that had defined the beginning of the evening. Instead, it carried quiet honesty. He thanked her for protecting the integrity of the conversation instead of exposing his mistake for personal satisfaction. He admitted that she could have embarrassed him in front of every investor, yet she had chosen professionalism over pride. Naomi offered the same calm smile she had worn throughout the night. She answered that everyone makes mistakes with language because language is alive, always teaching those willing to listen. The only mistake that truly matters, she said gently, is believing another person's uniform tells you everything about their mind. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before nodding in complete understanding. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only something important left to remember. As Naomi returned to resetting the room for the following day's guests, the restaurant slowly resumed its familiar rhythm. Candles were replaced. Crystal glasses were polished. Chairs were aligned with careful precision. To anyone arriving the next morning, the dining room would appear exactly as it always had. Yet for the people who had shared that evening, nothing about the room would ever feel quite the same again. Weeks later, Viktor Sokolov formally invited Naomi to consult on several international projects involving cultural communication and multilingual negotiations. She accepted after careful consideration, choosing to continue working with the same quiet professionalism that had defined her long before opportunity came searching for her. Ethan also made changes within Caldwell Ventures, encouraging his leadership team to value cultural understanding alongside technical expertise and reminding every executive that respect was not a courtesy reserved for boardrooms. It was the foundation upon which every lasting partnership depended. Years from now, no one would remember the menu served that evening or the vintage poured into crystal glasses. They would remember something much simpler. A billionaire believed language could separate people. A waitress proved that language was meant to connect them. She never raised her voice. She never demanded recognition. She never tried to win an argument. She simply answered with grace when the moment required truth. And in the quiet that followed, everyone in the room learned the same unforgettable lesson. Power may command attention for a moment, but character earns respect that lasts a lifetime.